Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Chana Lee, and I am Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm also the faculty coordinator for the History of Slavery project. I'm here today as a panelist on our second session. We're calling it Slavery and UGA, the Lives and Afterlives of Enslaved People. My co-panelists include two of my wonderful graduate students, Valerie McLaurin and Choe. I will offer some more remarks about them when I introduce them. I have some slides. And this particular session, or my particular presentation, is on the history of slavery at the University of Georgia, a project overview. In November 2019, a team of 22 faculty and staff members began researching the history of slavery at the University of Georgia after receiving a $100,000 grant from the Office of Research headed by Vice President David Lee. The money was a gift from an anonymous donor, and we were fortunate to receive such support. It is important to note that we did not start the research completely from scratch. Professor Scott Nesbitt, a key member of our research team, and his students had already established a foundation upon which to build. With extensive research assistance provided by the Harvard Library staff on campus, they established some basic facts about slavery at UGA. Now, as a point of fact, a few of my colleagues often point out that the University of Georgia, as an institution, never owned other human beings. This is true and perhaps most relevant, though, in a comparative sense. Some schools were actually involved directly in enslaving Africans and African Americans, including participation in the slave trade. UGA was not one of those schools, but Franklin College, as the school was known during the 19th century, did have extensive ties to slavery through dozens of individuals from the first year it began holding classes in 1801 through the Civil War. In building on the early research, we decided to get a clearer sense of who actually enslaved people. We sought to clarify the scope of involvement. Let's start with 5 of the first 7 presidents. 4 of them were enslavers, and one of them, the first president, Abraham Baldwin, played a key role in promulgating a defense of slavery and slave trading in the public sphere. Baldwin was one of 4 Georgians to attend the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and one of 2 to sign the United States Constitution. It's not known whether he enslaved Black people. We don't think he did. However, he distinguished himself at the convention by advocating for the infamous 3/5 compromise to determine congressional representation and for the continuation of the international slave trade for an additional 20 years after ratification of the Constitution. That 3/5 refers to how the slave population would be counted for determining direct taxation and representation in the House of Representatives. What you see here on the screen is a statue. It was dedicated in 2011 by the UGA Alumni Association. He's also memorialized, and there's a hall named after him, Baldwin Hall. So that memorializes him as well as the statue. You know his name, obviously, because the building, Baldwin Hall, has been at the center of our fight to tell the story about slavery at UGA. In late, I believe it was 2015, some remains were uncovered there, and that sort of touched off our efforts to want to tell this story. Let me also say that while Baldwin is certainly celebrated, he drafted the charter, the school really doesn't get off the ground and have buildings and be involved in teaching until 1801. And that happens under the presidency of Josiah Meiers, who served between 1801 and 1810. He condemned slavery at points in his life, and he argued that the impact of whites was a negative one. It affected their independence and willingness to work. He claimed that he never enslaved a human being. However, I read recently in family history or a biography done by his son that recalls that his family did keep a quote unquote Negro woman who lived and served the family for a period of time. The son referred to this person as his father's slave. Where is he and how is he memorialized at UGA? There's a Meigs Teaching Award. And there's Meigs Hall, the institute, the home for the Institute of Higher Education. There would be two presidents before Moses Wado, and they were John Brown, who served between 1811 and 1816, and also Robert Finley, who served in 1817. Neither one of them enslaved African Americans. Moses Wado did, however, and sometimes people, I think now pronounce the name Waddell, but the family is very clear that it was pronounced Wado. He served the between 1819 and 1829. That was the second longest period for the 19th century in terms of presidents and their service. He was the first Southern born. Many of the others before him, or the others, including Baldwin before him, were New Englanders. He was the founding pastor of First Presbyterian Church here in Athens, and he essentially stabilized the college. There was a lot of uncertainty about the future of the school. There was a lot of financial crisis in the early 1810, 1811. There was a problem with a drop in enrollment. And by enrollment, of course, it's important to understand that we're not talking about, the University of Georgia, of course, with 30,000 students in the 19th century. At best, prior to the Civil War, there were about 130 students on campus. Moses Wado enslaved 16 persons on the sizable plantation, and some worked on campus after 1820. And as I mentioned before, Wado Hall memorializes him. There's Alonzo Church, the longest serving president, also another clergyman, enslaved 9 persons in 1850 and 13 by 1860. He's known for his cruelty. He also mentioned in his writings his bondspeople by name. There's a second session I want to point you to after this one. There's a wonderful student, Aubrey Newby, who's done some work on Alonzo Church. I don't want to step on his project in any way. So I'm gonna just mention what I've mentioned here and also say that he was memorialized, or he has been memorialized through the naming of Residence Hall, Church Hall. But I encourage you to see the next session on Church. Finally, from the 19th century, just before going into the war, there was Andrew Lipscomb, who served 1860, 1874. He was an Alabama native. The census records, 1860, showed that he enslaved 54 people. I was really struck by the fact that so many of them were very young people, and there weren't a lot of older people listed on the census schedule. 31 of the 54 that he enslaved were between the ages of 2 and 17. And of that number, 16 of them were under the age of 10. And we have another residence hall named after another enslaver president, Lipscomb Hall. I want to talk about what we've learned about faculty members. There haven't been a lot of real surprises in terms of our research, or at least I wouldn't characterize them as surprises, but I was a little, this sort of gave me pause, the fact that there were so many, and these are some of the famous name professors, that so many of them for that same time period enslaved other human beings. And they are the sort of the noted families, the notables for the state of Georgia, for its history. Joseph LeConte and John LeConte, his brother, were big owners of other people. The Lumpkins are mentioned, or Joseph Lumpkin at least is mentioned here. The entire Cobb family was a large slave owning family. James Wado, who was the son of Moses Wado. So what we did is that we, in trying to measure UGA's involvement in slavery, we looked at professors, and we looked at how many, and we looked at the extent of their enslavement of other people. There were 76 professors that we identified in total between 1801 and 1865. 24 of them were enslavers, and these are some of the ones who owned the most. Second, there are the trustees. The trustees comprise a kind of governing body for the university and made important decisions about, for example, providing money for hiring out enslaved people, decisions about, building new buildings, all sorts of business that the university conducted. The trustees were the ones who made the important decisions. And over time, we found that of the 38 trustees who were not faculty members, who were not alumni, and who were not presidents, and I'll explain that in a minute, 30 were involved in slavery. The whole sort of way in which the university was run was that it was kept pretty exclusive. And a lot of folks who were alumni also came back to serve as trustees. And also many of the presidents, I believe the majority of them, maybe just two, were trustees themselves. And a lot of the professors went on to become trustees. So we found it interesting to measure the extent of their involvement as well. Then there are also, this is in my way here. Then we collected data for the alumni. We looked at 710. We checked their wills, their census schedules. This is what we were able to find. And 303 alumni held enslaved persons on 2 major plantations, or that included 2 plantation owners, and within their household. That was about 43% of the alumni that we searched. Now, I need to say something about this, some of you may wonder why we included alumni in our examinations. Here's why we included these details about the legacy of slavery at their former school. Some of them or their families were enslavers during their time on campus. This is something that we're still disaggregating. Some of them went on to serve as trustees for the college, as I just mentioned, thereby extending their connection to UGA and the institution of slavery. In other words, they would go on to play an influential role in the school's growth. Third, even if they did not hold an official position at the school as alumni, they would on occasion become important sources of funding for the construction of buildings and other campus expenses. One early example of the alumni coming to the rescue involved the Cobbs and the Lumpkins and a few others, paying off the debt of the Phi Kappa Hall, which was erected in 1836 and built by the Literary Society of the same name. When the legislature refused making the payment, the alumni stepped up in 1838 to provide the final $5,000 owed on what one historian described as a large hall of architectural dignity and beauty. The Demosthenians, a literary society, were rescued and provided for in the same way in previous years. So these alumni became important supporters of the institution in a general way, in this specific way, and also in a general way, providing funding for further buildings and large occasions, such as the big commencement celebration, which was a very festive occasion that included a ball. Finally, we've considered the alumni in our research because we decided to think in a broader way about UGA and its ties to slavery. We decided to think beyond the immediate campus environment as a sole boundary of physical space and time period. We found it useful to think in a broader way about institutional ties through UGA affiliated individuals and their own histories. We decided that these associations mattered even if some went on to become an individual owner or otherwise directly participated after he matriculated. And UGA was always represented as a he, or this particular kind of person was always represented as a he, since women were not openly admitted to the school until 1918, obviously after slavery ended. My own thinking is based on a relatively expansive notion of impact and participation. Some of the most celebrated men in the state got their start at the University of Georgia. It was their association that gives them a certain standing that facilitated further advantages that accounted for their status in the accumulation of wealth and power. There was a generative effect, quite literally. This initial influence and power created generations of powerful individuals who controlled much of the state's history during the 19th and 20th centuries. It is important to consider slavery's full impact across the generations and immediate location. A history of slavery in UGA includes female enslavers as well. When UGA personnel were not exploiting the labor of their own enslaved people, they hired enslaved laborers belonging to others. The hire out system was a profitable practice of effectively renting or loaning enslaved persons to the institution at an agreed upon price paid to owners. Among these participants was Sarah H. Harris, who did regular business with the school beginning in 1836, and even registered a complaint and had a sort of legal dispute with the school over the death of one of her enslaved persons, a man who died during the 1845 school year. If you take a look at this slide, here's some biographical information about her. Born in Virginia, died at 83, and she's buried in Oconee Hill Cemetery across from the football stadium on campus. She had 7 children, and her husband left her pretty soon. He preceded her in death pretty soon. She is listed as the head of household on all the census schedules from 1830 to 1860. And she enslaved 16 people in 1830, as you see on the screen, 15, 13, and 6 people. I've already mentioned the dispute she had with over the death of an enslaved man. She appears in the Southern Banner, calling for the return of one of her young female enslaved persons. Her daughter was an enslaver as well, and her son, she had a direct connection to Franklin College. Her son, Samson Harris, was someone who attended the school. But to build on the first phase of our team's work, I wanted to take a much closer look at the identities and experiences of enslaved African Americans who worked and lived on campus, or who may have had some other connection to Franklin College. So along with the help of my colleagues, Dr. Nesbitt and Dr. Jennifer Rice of the Geography Department, we focused on creating an archive during early summer of 2020. By that point, we had become a much smaller team with a heavy reliance on graduate and undergraduate student researchers. Many of the original faculty had moved on to other research priorities and refocused on other matters. The most important question that we have attempted to answer is, who were these African Americans, and do we know about their exploited, uncompensated labor on campus? What were their names? How did they live as individuals, as members of families, and possibly communities? Without question, this remains the hardest task for our group. Most enslaved people did not leave behind their own written records, and they appear in government records as property, as chattel, identified as slaves or servants of a household. We learn ages, gender, and color, Black or mulatto, from population census schedules. African Americans would not appear as whole persons, that is, fully named with family affiliations, until after emancipation. Prior to emancipation, what we learned about enslaved African Americans came from the records of their enslavers, or records about their activities of their enslavers: diaries, wills, deeds, tax digests, slave bills of sale, population census schedules, biographies, and early histories of the college, Athens, and neighboring towns and counties. So what can we say about what they did, about their labor? Enslaved Black Georgians built the earliest structures for the school, including the storied college chapel, the original administration building, and faculty housing. They washed clothes of the students and university personnel. They cooked and served meals. They swept, scrubbed, and mopped floors and washed walls. They tended the campus gardens and took care of animals. They dug wells and carried water, hauled wood to build fires, and they maintained the campus gardens. In addition, they were responsible for providing transportation for university personnel to get from location to location throughout the county and beyond. They took care of the famous chapel and served as bell ringers. Now, the most important part for me has been the search for and identification of enslaved Athenians who had some ties to individuals associated with Franklin College. I want to move on to talk about some of those, but I want to say that we're in the process of compiling a naming database. We have approximately 700 names of individuals who at one point were enslaved in Athens. We have linked a fraction of them to UGA presidents, professors, trustees, and alumni. And we continue our search. The search requires that we move back and forth in time, and that we look at a lot of post-emancipation records and try to identify individuals from those. Let me introduce you to some of the people we do know and know pretty well, because they appear in these old school histories and family memoirs, diaries, correspondence, newspapers, government records. Of course, the most famous, probably the most famous of formerly enslaved Athenians was Lucius Henry Hulsey. He became eventually the bishop of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, an author of his own. It's called an autobiography, but it includes a lot of his speeches. And he was associated with Payne College, then called Payne Institute. There was Louis Fennessy, who was a Black Baptist minister on campus. A few years prior to the Civil War, the school allowed Blacks to attend the Baptist church on campus. It had been, I think it had been belonged previously to a white church on campus. And there were more than a few churches on campus. And this lasted for only so long, and Blacks could attend the church, but whites, of course, had to be present. And eventually, there were a lot of complaints about their presence on campus. The rule was that Blacks could be on campus if they worked, but otherwise, they could not come on campus. One of the things I'm curious about is if there were actually free Black Athenians who attended this church on campus. There are also some names that recur throughout various written records. Richard Corley, I think Richard Corley and Dick Carey are the same people, but I think that, we kind of have to look over this again. He's listed on our many spreadsheets as a different person, but I'm not so sure now. I was just thinking about this up until like last night. Someone named Blenheim, Louis O. Tubb, they are talked about in these very sort of paternalistic ways, and all of the bell ringers are talked about in that way, as being obedient, dutiful, serious about the idea of going to the church and ringing a bell. There was William Hull, a carpenter. Also, I wanted to put up Samuel Harris, later Samuel Watkins. He was a maker of fires and also served as a bell ringer. There's a lot of lore that this is a Samuel Harris who might have secretly attended classes at Georgia and was especially interested in math. I promise you, we're still looking, but I'm not seeing any evidence for that just yet. But I promise I'll keep looking. Then you'll notice that a lot of the people who get mentioned in these earlier histories and diaries, these journals and correspondence of enslavers are all men. But I found a couple of repeat references to washerwomen who worked in and around the botanical garden and also in the student and faculty residences. And the references to them obviously are quite, negative. They're usually described as having a loud mouth, being sort of, unwilling to work at a certain pace, essentially just kind of having a bad attitude and not being cooperative. And of course, you know how you have to take that sort of information. Certainly one has to question it. I'm not saying it wasn't true, but certainly, you have to question that sort of representation. We just need more information. There is one other person, Isaac Derricott, who actually worked on a nearby plantation, but in the ex-slave narratives, he talks about how his family every day went down to, each commencement day, went down and celebrated with the rest of the school. There's also so much we just will never know. I want to close by sharing some observations about this current moment in public history. I understand that I want to close by sharing some observations. I undertook this work knowing full well the tense political context and political fears and pressures that come with the demand to uncover the racist legacies of large institutions such as the University of Georgia. Being a trained historian, I began to work mindful sound methods and a careful consideration of documentary evidence. This is difficult, time-consuming work. Among the finds are mere fragments, and we often must resort to informed speculation. This sort of work concerns some school administrators here and at other institutions. The concerns have to do with the implications of this sort of research. How will the public, especially descendant communities, respond to our findings? Members of our team advocated bringing in community members and having them shape the research based on their interests, concerns, and priorities. With the logistical challenges and the pull of other priorities for my colleagues, still, we have never stopped thinking about the role of the community and how they could help this sort of project, and also what their interests are. This involvement was made difficult by a restriction placed on the grant. We were not allowed to spend any funds on non-UGA persons. This not only seemed mean and inconsiderate, but this condition was a hindrance as well. This project was a response to the uncovering of remains buried at Baldwin Hall. Scholars don't start their historical research by focusing on what it could mean or even what we hope it could mean. In other words, we have no control over how our research may be used. And likewise, we can't run from the facts supported by evidence. And yet this seemed to be a worrisome fact for some of our administrators. Some of you may know that we had to fight just to explore this story. And this was truly stressful and at times felt like an unnecessary workplace hazard for our health. So now UGA has joined the 70 or so institutions that are examining their legacies of slavery and racial segregation. UGA steps into the moment of reckoning, and that begins by acknowledging its white supremacist roots, as hard as this may seem for hidebound supporters of the institution. Will our students and their families and our communities begin to demand reparations in the form of targeted scholarships or other relief? Maybe, but historical wrongs create debts that are owed. Such an expectation of demand is hardly popular among current administrators or some student bodies at many institutions. Still, it does not mean that there can never be a public conversation about the issue or even action taken. I want to leave contact information here. I'd love to hear from you. The grant period ends June 30th, 2021. If you have any questions, suggestions, sources, or historical information that may be helpful, we'd love to hear from you. I will share our contact information. It's on the screen here. Next up is my graduate student, Valerie McLaurin, and she's going to be followed by another graduate student. Valerie is a second-year PhD student in the Department of History at the University of Georgia. She earned her MA from Coastal Carolina University in her hometown of Conway, South Carolina. She has worked for 2 semesters as a research assistant on the history of slavery at UGA project. She will be followed by Christian Choe, a second-year master's student at the University of Georgia. He's working primarily with Professor Stephen Mim. He's currently writing his thesis on the federal administration of the Panama Canal and the Canal Zone during the construction period from 1904 to 1914. He is from my hometown, Los Angeles. I'll stop the share, okay? Go ahead, Valerie.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, and good morning, everyone. I began as a research assistant on the history of slavery at UGA project last summer. I'm first going to describe a bit of what our methodology was like before I move on to the main topic of my presentation, Dora Stevens and her relationship to her enslaver, UGA alumnus Alexander Stevens. The goal of our research team was to link enslaved people in Athens to UGA alumni. We hoped to name as many of those enslaved people as possible. We knew a good deal of the enslavers were prominent figures in Georgia's history who attended this university in the first half of the 19th century. My colleagues and I split up a massive list of names taken from a catalog of UGA alumni who matriculated between 1804 to 1860, and Dr. Lee touched on our reasoning for this methodology earlier. We kept detailed work logs and developed a meticulous, time-consuming methodology as we researched each individual name we were assigned. For example, if we could confirm that an alumnus owned slaves, we then tried to figure out if the person had died before 1865, and if so, tried to locate their will to see if by any chance they mentioned the names of enslaved people. For plenty of alumni, we knew they enslaved people, sometimes how many, but we may never know those people's names. For example, I found that William LeConte, another brother of Joseph LeConte, whom the history building is named after, enslaved at least 72 people, according to the 1840 census. but the most we know about them is their presumed gender and approximate age. And these are the type of historical silences researchers encounter over and over when trying to uncover information about the enslaved. Often the most we can hope for are tiny fragments, scraps of information that ideally come together to create some kind of meaning, but those are few and far between. One of the names near the bottom of my list was Alexander Hamilton Stevens, and here he is in 1861. I recognize the name. He was the Vice President of the Confederacy, the 50th Governor of Georgia. Alexander Stevens' connections to the University of Georgia run deep. He began his studies at UGA in 1828 and graduated in 1832. He described his time at UGA as by far the happiest days of his life. During his time as a student, he was a member of the Phi Kappa Society. Once he graduated, he helped to finance the construction of Phi Kappa Hall, which was built in 1836. And after the Civil War, he helped to financially sponsor former Confederate soldiers that wanted to attend UGA from out of state.
Valerie, I'm sorry. Are you sharing your screen? Sorry.
Oh, it should be. Let's see.
There you go.
There we go. Can you see
Thank
Alexander
you.
Stevens? Oh,
yes. Okay. Sorry.
Thanks. Okay, so there's Alexander Stevens and some info I've been going over about him. And yeah, so later in his life, he was in the Board of Trustees from 1875 to 1883. His home, Liberty Hall in Crawfordville, Georgia, is a U.S. National Historic Landmark. And here's Liberty Hall, and you can see a large monument to Stevens out front. So academic literature and archival sources abound for Alexander Stevens. Multiple biographies have been written about him. I went through hundreds of pages of his plantation record books from the special collections that are kept here at UGA. Most of those were transactional and gave me no insight into the people he enslaved. I first encountered Dora's name and the names of her family members when I delved into his diary that was published in 1865. Alexander frequently references Dora's parents, Eliza and Harry, as well as her siblings. He purchased Eliza and Harry in the decades before the Civil War. The enslaved Stevens family lived and worked closely with Alexander in his home at Liberty Hall there, and Eliza was the cook, Harry was a personal servant. Last summer, I came across the Swan Auction Gallery's website, and listed on it was a set of family papers described as papers of two parallel Stevens families, the Confederate Vice President Alexander Stevens and his servants. I was excited that those documents might give us more insight into Dora and her family and Alexander, but I'm not well versed in auctions and library acquisitions, and I couldn't access them. So I reached out to Dr. Lee, who presented me with troubling news. The papers had been sold to a private buyer. And although our library has a prolific collection of materials on Alexander Stevens, they did not bid on these important papers of someone he had enslaved. But despite that, this past spring, as I continued my work as a research assistant, Dora Stevens didn't leave my mind. So for the next few minutes, I'll share what I was able to find out about her. Here's her gravestone. Eliza Stevens gave birth to Dora in Liberty Hall on July 2nd, 1857. She died with the last name Williams. Later, I discovered she remained unmarried until after Alexander Stevens' death, but married later in life and died a widow on May 20th, 1931, at the age of 74. And so here's a photograph of her family taken in 1866. Dora is the second child from the right, and that's her father, Harry, on the far left, and Eliza, her mother, in the striped dress, along with some of her siblings. And this photograph is one of the items from the Swan Auction Gallery. And so by sheer luck, the private buyer who purchased Dora's items ended up eventually donating them to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And then that museum very recently digitized and made a portion of that material public. And this is, again, all occurred really recently towards the very end of my research here. And I explain that to illustrate the turbulent nature of this kind of research. It can be extremely frustrating, but to have this photograph of Dora and her family is priceless, although many questions still remain. Harry, Eliza, and their children continued to live and work at Liberty Hall after the Civil War. Alexander Stevens died in 1883. In his will, which you can see a newspaper clipping of here, he mentioned by name only two formerly enslaved women, and the second person mentioned was Eliza Stevens, whom he gave permission to continue living at Liberty Hall, or home there. And then Dora, he left her a gold watch. So the major primary source material we have that allows us to hear Dora's voice can be found in the Library of Congress, Alexander Stephens collection, where there are several dozen letters from servants, and roughly 19 of those are written from Dora to Alexander in the decade before his death. A lot of the content of those letters that Dora wrote were descriptive, updating him about the daily life at Liberty Hall because he was away serving in the US House of Representatives. But all of Dora's letters to Alexander were also quite emotionally charged. She used very sentimental language towards him. And one name kept popping up that I couldn't quite place, Jeannie. In context, it seemed to refer to a child, but I knew it wasn't a younger sibling, and supposedly Dora didn't have any children. But then I saw on the 1880 census that Jeannie was listed as being the granddaughter of Harry and Eliza, and Dora lived in the same household. So here's sort of a makeshift family tree that I'll describe in just a moment. And I'm going to briefly pause to highlight something that I only recently came across as I worked on this conference paper. So while trying to verify a quote from Alexander Stephens, I found an Atlanta Journal-Constitution article published last July titled "The Black Family That Claims Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, as an Ancestor." In it, Jill Patton explains that she is a Black descendant of Alexander Stephens and that this information has been passed down in her family generation after generation. And I'd like to say thank you to Jill, as I believe she and some of her family are in the audience today. So in that news article, she plainly states that she and her family are living proof that Alexander Stephens was a rapist. They are descended from Alan Stephens, and he's on the far left of the family tree there. And so on the top right, you can see Dora's parents, Eliza and Harry. But before they got together, Eliza gave birth to Alan soon after Alexander Stephens purchased her when she was about 12 years old in 1845. Years later, Alexander granted Eliza permission to marry a fellow slave, Harry. Eliza and Harry then went on to have more children, including Dora and her siblings there. And census records tell us that Jeannie is their granddaughter, but again, that relationship is still unclear. So biographies of Alexander Stephens have always described him as a lifelong childless bachelor. Descriptions of him fixate on his physical stature, sickly, frail, didn't weigh more than 100 pounds. And in her interview with the AJC, Jill Patton explained, "I see glimpses of Grandpa Stephens in our family, the small frames, prominent cheekbones, and my grandmother, mom, and several aunts." So what does Jill Patton's blunt revelation about Alexander Stephens mean for Dora Stephens? I'm still in the process of figuring that out, but it has made me circle back around to the person I couldn't quite identify, Jeannie. And I'm going to share a couple of excerpts of letters that Dora wrote to Alexander Stephens when Jeannie would have been a young child. "I miss you calling me every evening. I wish you were here. Jeannie went to your room, Dora, the other day and knocked and went all over the house at every door, and sister told her that master was gone and she cried. I think she thought of you. I will write to you again soon. With much love, I remain your friend, Dora Stephens." "Little Jeannie talks about you. She says she wants to see you very bad. She is always telling Mr. Armstrong and all what you used to give her and what you used to say to her. And they don't seem to believe it, and it makes her very mad. They don't think that you think as much of us as we think you do. All our talk from morning until night is Master Alex. It is my talk all day long." So Dora was filled with deep emotion for Alexander and was compelled to update him on how Jeannie was doing in several of the documents that we have from her. And here's a final example where Dora wrote a letter to her mother, Eliza, when she was working away from home and had fallen ill. She says, "Dear mother, I was sick for 2 or 3 weeks after I came here. So glad to hear that my little girl is doing so well. Tell her to be smart and good. I'm going to give her something nice for Christmas if I live. She must write to her mother as often as she can." And this is the first time that we see Dora describe herself as having a little girl and as a mother. And many people have portrayed Dora as a loyal slave with paternalistic, lifelong commitment to Alexander Stephens. Not many have asked why that might be. And we know very little about Dora's life in her later years or what happened to Jeannie. But we do know that in 1927, she was present at the unveiling of the statue of Alexander Stephens that sits at the US Capitol to this day. She was invited, but not allowed to speak. The governor of Georgia at the time spoke for her, saying, "I have the distinguished honor To present to this audience, Dora Stevens, the only living slave of Alexander H. Stevens. She lived at the old home place, and it is a great honor to be able to present one of these slaves to the people of America. Dora died a few years later in 1931, and on the left you can see a newspaper article titled "Antebellum Servant Dies" that reads, Dora Stevens, said to be the last of the family servants who waited on Alexander H. Stevens, died here Thursday. And that's her death certificate on the right. So in terms of UGA's legacy and its relationship to Alexander Stevens, Phi Kappa Hall, which I mentioned earlier, that he helped to fund, still stands as the 7th oldest building on campus. Phi Kappa holds a yearly event where members give competitive speeches. And until a few years ago, that event was called the Alexander Stevens Declamation. In 2019, the Phi Kappa Literary Society voted to rename the event the Phi Kappa Declamation. But it's fair to say that Alexander Stevens still haunts our campus, and his connection to it and the enslavement of Black Georgians merits further study. So in closing, we might think we know plenty about Alexander Stevens, class of 1832, who infamously proclaimed that the great truth of white supremacy would be the cornerstone of the Confederacy. But in light of what Jill Patton and her family have shared, how much do we really know? And what might that imply for the legacy of this UGA alumnus? And as for Dora, I also wonder what's stopping historians from interrogating the oversimplification of what was obviously a complicated relationship between her and Alexander. I still have many lingering questions as I look for Dora that remain unanswered now, but continuing to untangle the life of her mother, Eliza, her brother, Alan, her relationship to Jeannie and Alexander Stevens are just the beginning of that journey. I'm going to pass it over to Christian now.
Good morning. I'm here to present Owned and Valued, what wills and tax digests tell us about slavery in UGA. When studying American slavery, historians must be ready to enter a balancing act fraught with questions of ethics and responsible practices. An institution so deeply ingrained in our history as to have consequences that reverberate so gravely in the present day, the historiography of slavery is uniquely burdened with the weights of interpretations and implications that have shaped, seldom positively, often detrimentally, the ways we interact with one another. Stigma surrounds quantitative analyses of slavery in particular. Such methodologies have often been characterized as problematic for their impersonality and seeming indifference to the interpersonal, psychological, and material effects of the institution on the enslaved people who endured it. In response, recent scholars have granted overwhelming attention to the lived experiences of specific enslaved individuals, extrapolating from these experiences arguably more accurate illustrations of what it meant to live in slave society. Over the past year, graduate student researchers processed sources that have traditionally elicited top-down analyses of slavery, most notably census records, wills, and tax digests. In the past, producing historical narratives from such sources limited the historian to very distant portraits of slavery. Scholars could tease out slavery's skeletal structure, musculature, and connective tissue to show how the system operated, but they also tended to conglomerate disparate experiences into a singular average, thereby producing stereotypes that obscured more than elucidated the experience of any enslaved person. But just as people are not beholden to the agreements of their parents, as Rousseau argues in The Social Contract, historians are not beholden to the same interpretations of sources as their predecessors and may extract different narratives from these sources. And so traditionally top-down sources should not automatically beget top-down narratives. My presentation this morning will examine the wills and tax digests of antebellum Athens, Clarke County. Two similar questions with different inflective points sit at the heart of my presentation. What do these sources tell us, and what can these sources tell us? First, I will share and review some of the concrete findings that student researchers have processed over the past 2 years. I will also try to explain briefly the importance of developing an efficient process for digesting sources. Second, I will examine the benefits and limits of using these historical sources to make a case for bringing quantitative history back in, if only slightly. Before going further, I think it's important to contextualize my perspectives on the study of slavery with my background as an historian who neither studies slavery nor trained to study slavery. Generally, I conduct research on 20th century business and organization, so I offer my perspectives on a subdiscipline that has its own rich history and intellectual development as an outsider looking in. That brings advantages and disadvantages. Most obviously, my familiarity with the literature is not the greatest, and what I do know about antebellum slave society is paltry compared to many of my colleagues. While I'm certainly not expert in the history of slavery, I hope the way I think about other historical questions might contribute something of interest, such as the nature, after all, of interdisciplinary study, or perhaps in this case, intersubdisciplinary study. HSUGA asked, as Dr. Lee noted, how was the university engaged with slavery and to what extent did it benefit from slavery? To try to measure this, we had to look at people affiliated with the university with direct ties to slavery, that is, find the people who held slaves between 1801 and 1865. The Wills and Tax Digest offered a two-pronged approach to that question, tackling two demographics with some overlap of individuals connected to the university. Wills gave us the names and numbers of people enslaved by UGA's alumni, faculty, and administrators across the antebellum and war periods. Tax Digest gave us information on the people of the Athens community during that time. Of course, Dr. Lee just presented much of our findings, so I won't replay that. Slave schedules of the antebellum census records indicate whether or not specific individuals held enslaved folks. And though not all alumni left adequate records traceable through Ancestry.com or Family Search, our primary genealogical databases, we were able to gather data on about half of the alumni who graduated before 1865. Alumni held at one time or other approximately 8,369 enslaved individuals. The median household held 15 enslaved people, and 75% of alumni households recorded 36 enslaved people or fewer. There was not an insignificant number of graduates, however, who held over 100 enslaved people. 13 alumni, approximately 4.4% of the 710, recorded so many slaves in their census records. The largest of these belonged to George W. Cooper of Sumter, South Carolina, whose household recorded 374 on the eve of the Civil War. More important for our project than the above snapshot, however, was the process of reclaiming the names of enslaved people from their enslavers' wills, the importance of which Dr. Lee and Val have already discussed. Slavery and the slave schedules transformed the enslaved into faceless numbers for institutional use and analysis, attempting to strip them of their humanity. In an effort to reverse the dehumanizing power of slavery, returning names to the enslaved community was symbolically important. And though we have only a fraction of these names, I think it's been worthwhile work. These wills were useful for gathering information on persons directly affiliated with the university in some official or academic capacity, but UGA did not exist totally isolated on some astral plane accessible only to folks on school business. As far back as the early 19th century, believe it or not, Athens Clarke County was also characterized by both town and gown. To find the impact of slavery on the community beyond the arch, we looked at Tax Digest for Clarke County. And before diving into the exciting world of taxes, I'd like to recognize Victoria Doe and Devin Jerome, who conducted most of the research and analyses of these documents. These documents, transcribed by members of the Clarke Oconee Genealogical Society around 2006, give estate information including the number of enslaved people held on each property. In 1804, the county levied a head tax of 31¼ cents for each person held in captivity, so accurate record keeping was important for a government that relied on those records for revenue. This tax on enslaved people is simultaneously useful and unhelpful. While they show the extent to which the community relied on enslaved labor, this tax obscures the real value of that labor. Later tax digests, specifically post-1858 documents, give us a clearer image of how much money enslavers invested in slave labor and how much property value was manifested in people. Between 1815 and 1858, the number of enslaved people within Athens and Clarke County fluctuated. Athens experienced massive growth in the number of enslaved during that time period, from 27 to 765, while Clark County saw greater fluctuations with an enslaved population of 64 in 1818 that grew to 108 in 1830 before dipping down to 63 in 1858. Again, key demographic information on the enslaved people is missing from these records, so it's difficult to estimate what kind of value they represented to their slaveholders. Moreover, it's nearly impossible to track how their productive labor flowed into the university's growth and development over this 50-year period. The 1858 Tax Digest does offer some indication of the value of enslaved people, but that information can only be reliably indicative of the situation in 1858. Nevertheless, it appears that the investments in enslaved people represented approximately 1/3 of the total value of Athens's and Clark County's estates. While we could extrapolate from the singular snapshot and assume that the enslaved figured into 1/3 of the property values across the antebellum period, that estimation would be purely speculative and unreliable. Even more egregious, it's an irresponsible assessment of human life that I find discomforting reporting even here. Part of the Clark County Tax Digest's greater utility as a source base lies in its scope, being recorded and made available for nearly every year between 1802 and 1865. But we didn't digitize and retranscribe each record because that would have been incredibly time-consuming and would have delivered rapidly diminishing marginal returns. Rather, we opted to take snapshots at roughly 5-year intervals to see the gradual change over time without sacrificing energy that we might have more wisely allocated elsewhere. And this raises the issue of efficient labor. As Dr. Lee mentioned, the HSUGA grant has an end date, so researchers couldn't spend countless hours being totally accurate in one chunk of data such that they neglect the rest. Tax digests, wills, and census records are pretty sizable source bases, so developing a mental conveyor belt to speedily process data is important. At the start of summer, I helped to devise a system that facilitated the way graduate researchers processed online documents and spreadsheets. Rather than jump into looking through the databases to find information on the first few names on my list, I spent a couple days getting to know the databases with which we would work. Taking our work with Ancestry.com as an example, one might have disregarded the Find the Grave index when searching for wills in that database. However, it became apparent to me just how useful it was when considering how many alumni died after emancipation in 1865. How many alumni would have wills that no longer included the names of enslaved individuals? Therefore, going pigheadedly into the database, filtering only for wills, would have been a total time suck, since those wills would not have included the names of formerly enslaved individuals because they were no longer their property to bequeath. Coupled with the fact that the 1906 alumni catalog seldom included vital information, the grave index made it more immediately clear which alumni would have fruitful wills and for which alumni we'd have to rely on the census records and slave schedules of 1850 and 1860. We should all do our best to familiarize ourselves with the programs we use. This isn't limited to learning the different features of disparate databases. It also entails understanding the differences, for example, in the applications of the Google Suite versus the Microsoft Suite. Not to suggest that historians become computer scientists, but even intermediate knowledge of these systems with which we work so intimately really improves workflow. At this year's Business History Conference, I attended a virtual roundtable discussing digital sources. And one speaker, Douglas Ord of the University of Maryland, emphasizes this very importance of understanding computers and data processing systems to facilitate historical research. This talk really resonated with me as I thought about my presentation for this symposium. Having a glut of sources and data is often just as debilitating as facing a paucity of data if you don't know how to process it efficiently. Controversially, perhaps, I believe data shouldn't dictate the research we do. I believe having a better grasp of our applications makes it easier to generate important historical analyses that might otherwise be overlooked. I've noticed a recent turn away from quantitative analysis in history, that is, statistical analysis, particularly in the study of slavery. Even descriptive statistics seems to have gone by the wayside, not to mention inferential statistics. And as a business/economic historian, my primary point of reference has been the place of Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman's Time on the Cross in the historiography, the criticisms of which I'd encountered from many students and professors as an undergraduate. But contemporary responses to Time on the Cross seem much more optimistic than criticisms leveled against the book today. Even Herbert Gutman's response in Slavery in the Numbers Game, which rejected the text as, quote, very disappointing, unquote, believed the methods to be rather useful tools in describing regularities in social behavior, and would thereby allow the social historian to begin reconstructing neglected or misinterpreted aspects of slave culture and slave beliefs. However, Gutman's fear that Vogel and Engerman's many errors would turn students of the Afro-American experience away from methods and quantitative data seems to have been realized since the 1970s. Part of the problem rests in scholars' discomfort with the implications of employing numbers to represent the enslaved experience. In some ways, it is recreation and perpetuation of the enslaver's fixation with the wrenching of humanity from the enslaved. And we shouldn't imply that these numbers represent the totality of the slave experience, but I think the negative attention Vogel and Engerman received, and which has been, in my opinion, exaggerated today, really had to do with their failure to scrutinize the numbers, not the general use of these numbers. A major part of the historian's job is interrogation of sources, which Vogel and Engerman did not do adequately. As a result, as Gutman would argue, the conclusions at which they arrived were clearly erroneous and misguided. And so it becomes a matter of responsibly interpreting the numbers, of playing the part of historian, of refusing to take the numbers at face value, translating the statistics accurately, understanding the fundamentals taught in statistics courses today can help us do that. Conventional sources such as census records, wills, and tax digests cannot tell us everything, nor should we pretend that they do. But I think it is worthwhile to take what they do present quantitatively and integrate that with our qualitative research. The two approaches should not stand alone, but rather the one should bolster the other and vice versa. I hope this encourages us to think about the ways we might develop our digital and quantitative toolkits to utilize the resources available to us to their fullest. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Valerie. I'm so proud of you all. We have one question. I really kind of blew it on time. I'm sorry, I just wanted to say what I wanted to say, but I've been my group has texted, my team has texted me, and so they've told me I could answer maybe one. So this is an interesting question. I believe it's from Ann Kimbrough. Dr. Chana Lee, I'm curious as to why it was necessary by, and I guess she means by whom, to erect a statue of former President Baldwin, a known enslaver. Do you have any reasons why this took place? So as I said before, we don't believe he owned slaves, but he certainly defended the system. What I found in about, I guess, 2010 or 2009, the idea first came up, and the person who takes credit for it is a professor on campus. I think this person is still with us, that is still at the school. Professor Locke Johnson, Regents Professor of Public and International Affairs, came up with the idea. And what he said, quote, "In my spare time, I would walk around these beautiful campuses and I was struck by their founders' statues. They added to the sense of history and tradition." And so that was, you know, his concern. He wanted us to recognize the UGA's deep sort of roots. Funding for the statue eventually came from private donations, and I think they started with $60,000, a grant from the UGA Alumni Association. So that's why it's a sense of wanting to feel connected to one of the founders and a deeper sense of history. Let's see, got more. Oh, okay, this is from, Dr. Hillary Green. Thank you for, how might network mapping help to understand the scope of slavery's impact from presidents to alumni? Also, have you found any wills of former enslaved people? Did Dora Stevens, Valerie, did Dora Stevens leave a will? Did others that you know of? I'm not sure about the mapping question. I'm hoping to learn that from you, Hillary. Go ahead, Valerie.
Yeah, and Dora did leave a will, but it just wasn't particularly helpful. But that's a great avenue, I think, of like a next phase of research where we could start looking at wills for the enslaved people that we have named, like Dora, for example.
What did she have to leave behind?
She left some portion of her money to the Daughters of the Confederacy, for example. So it definitely
Get
kind
out of here.
yeah, it complicates her story for sure. Yeah.
Okay. I'll go with one more, people. I'm sorry, a lot of you attended, over almost 200 people. Okay, Dr. Lee mentioned the death of an enslaved person at UGA. Do you have any information about the cause of death? No, I don't. But one of the things I've neglected to mention in my talk were the instances of abuse that are documented not only in the local Athens paper, but also in some of the school records. There was an instance of, well, I mentioned the death, but there was another instance where students really pummeled this Black man, an older Black man, and he was left bloodied and some say even disfigured. So abuse was a real thing. It was an aspect of this kind of slavery as well. Okay. Well, we have run out of time. Again, I'm very sorry about that, but I did leave my contact information. And again, I really hope to see most of you or hear from some of you. If you have pointers, questions, whatever, okay? Thank you so much for coming. Have a good day.